One of the more confusing topics for me when I was first getting into the off-road world was trying to understand the difference between an enduro motorcycle, a dual sport, and an adventure bike. They're all made to go off-road and they can all ride on-road. So how the hell do you tell the difference? Particularly if you're a brand new rider trying to figure out which one is best suited for your kind of riding. Well, today I'm going to try and break it down, make it as simple as possible, and try and make a clear example of each category and which of the enduro, dual sport, or adventure bike is best suited for your riding needs. The first thing we need to do is remove rider skill from the conversation completely, because that will only confuse things more and distort what we're trying to think about. Because a really good rider can take pretty much any bike and ride it in any situation, because their skill set can overcome the deficit. And we're really trying to look at the intended purpose of the motorcycle when it's constructed by the manufacturer, as that will give us the clearest idea of which category the bike belongs in. The other thing I wanted to point out is that everyone's got a different opinion, and that's just fine. You might have a different idea of what an enduro, a dual sport, and an adventure bike is, as long as you're clear about what's what. If you disagree with my definitions, put your reasons why and what you think the real definition should be. I've tried to collate the general consensus for each of these categories. Not everyone will agree with each of these category definitions, but the majority probably will. So moving forward, let's talk about the three major categories of enduro, dual sport, and adventure bikes, and the generally held and agreed identifying characteristics of each. Let's start with the enduro motorcycle. That's the easiest one to explain here. This was a development out of the MX bike scene, which the MX bike scene was a development out of the original Scramblers, the first motorcycles to really be developed intentionally for off-road use. So the enduro bike, like all the bikes in this list, can trace its genes back to the Scrambler, but the enduro came first before the dual sport and before the adventure bike, so I think it's important to start here. It developed out of the MX racing scene, and instead of riding in a loop in an off-road dedicated park, instead it was for cross-country racing. So that means the headlights came back on, often the indicators and a license plate was also attached, and a wide ratios gearbox that were made for enduro style racing. So this category is a lot easier to identify because they have a specific purpose: to race in endurance racing, hence the term enduro. So this bike of all the bikes is the easiest to categorize. Think of bikes like KTM's EXC range, bikes like Beta's RRS's, Yamaha's WRF series. You can find them in the races like the Paris-Dakar or the Red Bull Romaniacs. Long distance technical off-road riding where premium componentry, lightweight, and maximum performance are the top priority in building these motorcycles. It has a single cylinder motor. Its focus is on very high-end componentry, top-end long travel suspension, high performance out of the motor, high performance out of all of the components, with a focus on being as lightweight as possible. What separates it from an MX bike is going to be the license plate, the headlight, the indicators, the brake light, and of course that much wider ratio 6-speed gearbox. But before we dive into the dual sport, we need to clear up some of the confusion between these two categories, because from country to country, there's different rules and regulations, which causes different people to have different opinions. So let's compare Australia and America as a really good case in point as to how these two terms are very different depending on where you live. So the US, where I do not live, has a very different system to Australia. So not all enduro motorcycles in America come from the showroom floor with the license plate or can be road registered at a later date, as far as I understand it. And this has led particularly the motorcycle journalists in America to refer to some bikes that would be called enduro motorcycles outside of America as dual sports. They are the motorcycles within the enduro category that can go on and off-road because they have a license plate. Bikes like the EXC F series by KTM. However, in Australia, all enduro motorcycles come off the showroom floor with a license plate. So we call enduro bikes all enduro bikes. That means the KTM 500 EXC-F, which is often called a dual sport in America, is referred to here as an enduro bike because that's what we believe it is. It's made for the endurance racing category. It's part of the EXC lineup. So you can see the confusion starts already. So you really need to figure out where you're situated and how the laws determine what is what for you. The dual sport was developed out of the enduro bike. As all manufacturers do, they jumped on the popularity of the off-road riding and saw that not everyone needed a high-end race-specific bike like an enduro motorcycle. Some people still wanted to get off-road, but with a little more road capability and built to a more affordable price. Less hard-edged and tamed down a bit so it wasn't so fatiguing to ride, while still being pretty damn capable of riding off-road. Of course, all those features add a little bit of weight, so that's one of the defining characteristics between an enduro bike and a dual sport. A dual sport will be made focusing on trying to keep the bike reasonably light, but an enduro motorcycle will move heaven and earth to make that bike as light as possible. So that's one of the defining characteristics, is the weight category here. And that's the same thing when we get to adventure bikes. Weight is a very easy identifier of what category a bike could possibly belong to. And there are some general characteristics of the dual sport that we can go through. It's not as easy as the enduro bike category because there is a category of racing for the enduro motorcycle. You have to spend less time trying to figure out what's what. But with a dual sport, there's no race category for us to fall back on. So we have to go through the identifying characteristics of the dual sport. The first one is a single cylinder. This one is something to focus on strongly if you're trying to figure out, is it an adventure bike or is it a dual sport? If it's got a single cylinder, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be a dual sport or an enduro bike, not an adventure bike. Generally speaking, a dual sport won't have a motor bigger than 650 to 700-ish cc's. They'll have a small petrol or gas tank, as you call them in the US. You've got minimal plastics bolted to the bike. You don't have fancy aesthetics, big windscreens, lots of fairing to protect you from the elements. Needless stuff adds weight and is easy to break and you'll have to replace. So a dual sport will be far more bare bones than an adventure bike. They'll almost always have the same wheel setup or close to it as an enduro bike. So that's either a 21-inch, 18-inch wheel combo or a 21-inch, 17-inch wheel combo. And they will most definitely be spoke wheels. You won't see cast wheels on a dual sport. You'll see lots of ground clearance and lots of suspension travel. It might not necessarily be high end, but it will have a lot of travel and a lot of clearance. The other defining feature here is durability and longevity of the motorcycle, and that is a defining feature over the enduro bike category. Both will have single cylinder motors. The enduro bike, the difference here is the enduro will be focused on lightweight and performance. It will make a lot of power. It also needs a lot of TLC. So you will be servicing that bike measured in hours rather than kilometers. Whereas the dual sport, the bike is built around the motor, lasting a long time and needing minimal upkeep to look after. So you can go much further between having to service the bike. And the service manual will measure that in kilometers rather than hours. The gearbox is also somewhat of a defining feature here. Generally speaking, a dual sport will have a wider ratio gearbox than an enduro motorcycle because it is intended to spend more time on the road where you'll likely be doing higher speeds. Therefore, it has a bigger spread than the enduro bike. But generally speaking, it will have a closer spread gearbox compared to an adventure bike because a dual sport will be spending more time off-road than an adventure bike. So gearbox is another thing to pay attention to. They're all street legal, so you can ride them on and off-road straight off the showroom floor, no matter the country you're in. Now sure, you might not have all the fancy features and comfort of an adventure bike, and you might not have the ultimate performance that is an enduro bike when it comes to off-road. You might not always get there first on a dual sport, but you'll get there every time. And that is the quintessential dual sport, the durable, long-lasting, tough motorcycle that you can take just about anywhere. You might not do it as fast as everyone else, but you'll get there in the end. And classic dual sports are the DR650, Suzuki's DRZ400, Honda's CRF 300L, and their older XR series like the XR650L and the XR400, Yamaha's WR250R, KTM 690 Enduro R, don't let the name confuse you, it's a dual sport, Kawasaki's Gen 1 and maybe Gen 2 KLR 650 and the KLX 300. These are all quintessential dual sport motorcycles. I think the single defining feature of an adventure bike over a dual sport is comfort and road capability. Those are the two foundational things that really set it apart from the dual sport in what it's trying to achieve as a motorcycle. And the classic defining moment of the birth of the adventure bike was the BMW R80 GS. What set it apart from the Dual Sport was no longer was this a bike developed from the off-road world to make it a little more road capable. Now you had a bike that was developed from a road motorcycle and engineered backwards into the off-road world. So you're starting at different ends of the spectrum. Think of a Dual Sport from being developed out of an off-road motorcycle and an adventure bike trying to achieve the same thing but developed from a street bike. Because not everyone wants to spend their time on the highway on a single cylinder motorcycle revving its tits off, super lightweight, getting buffeted around by the wind on knobby tires, having your fillings vibrated out of your skull. And that's where the adventure bike came in and where the R80GS really took off, because it had 2 cylinders. That means that it's a whole hell of a lot smoother motor-wise. And the defining features of an adventure bike all circle around comfort and long distance. You're seeing luggage systems come onto bikes now. You're also seeing much more comfortable setups with windscreens, fairings, all the technology built into the bike with big TFT screens, cruise control, traction control, all the electronic wizardry, big comfortable seats as well. Not always, but a lot of the time you're seeing multiple cylinder motorcycles for that smoother motor and longer lasting engines for that long distance riding. You still have high ground clearance, but it's going to be lower than the Dual Sport. A gearbox again is going to be a defining characteristic. You're going to have much higher ratio gears up top in particular, because these bikes are far more developed to sit at highway speeds very comfortably while the engine doesn't have to do too much work. You're also seeing much bigger petrol tanks on these motorcycles to help you go longer distances. And because of the size and the weight of these motorcycles, you're seeing much more intricate and bigger brake systems on these motorcycles as well. Think of the adventure bike, as I pointed out, as a road bike developed to have some off-road characteristics, whereas the Dual Sport is coming out of the Enduro motorcycle to make it have some more on-road characteristics. One of the other identifying characteristics, which some people will point out as a disadvantage, is the weight. Adventure bikes, because of all that technology and comfort that they've added to the bike, as well as generally speaking being developed out of a road-based motorcycle, it adds a whole pile of weight. So adventure bikes typically are far heavier than their Dual Sport counterparts. So this means they can be a little more challenging to handle off-road, particularly if you're just starting out. It also means you've got a hell of a lot more expensive stuff to break if you do drop it. Adventure bikes tend to be more expensive than Dual Sports because you're getting a whole lot more motorcycle, just like the Enduro bike. No category out of these 3 is better than the other. It all depends on what you want and need out of the motorcycle and which is best suited to you. If you prioritize comfort, you're doing long distance, you're wanting to be able to carry an awful lot of luggage, and you also like technology on your motorcycle, an adventure bike might make a very smart choice. If you want a 50-50 motorcycle, a bike that is pretty damn competent off-road, but also can handle a decent amount of on-road riding, albeit without the creature comforts of an adventure bike, and you want simple reliability at an affordable price, the Dual Sport is probably the bike for you. And if you prioritize performance, you love going fast and riding really technical, difficult terrain, and you fancy yourself an amateur racer on the weekends and taking your bike to some competitions, then the Enduro motorcycle is the way to go. Within each of these categories, there's a spectrum within themselves, as some Dual Sports will be better off-road than on-road, and some Dual Sports will be better on-road than off-road. Same for the adventure bike category, and same for the Enduro bike category. Of course, I'd love to know what you think, because everyone's gonna have a little bit of a different take on that. And as always, guys, don't forget to stay shiny side up.